Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. Today we will be talking about the control scope process. So we will look into everything that you should know about control scope. We'll definitely go deep to understand this entire process. Now, as always, over here at pmclounge.com, we don't believe in memorizing the inputs, the tools and techniques and outputs of every process. That is of no use unless and until you understand why why you have those inputs in a certain process, right? Why are you going to be using any tools and techniques if you are going to use for those inputs, and how you are going to generate those outputs from the process, right? So we never encourage you to memorize inputs and tools and techniques and outputs. We'd rather want you to understand why you have certain inputs, why you use certain tools and techniques, and how you get those outputs out, right? So it's important to understand the processes rather than memorizing, all these names and not understanding the process, or just, superficially reading what this process does. So let's go deep. Let's talk about control scope process. First up, why is this important? We always talk about it. So it is a matter of critical balance between accepting what needs to be done and what needs to be avoided as well to keep the project on track. So you are controlling the project scope, right? You are in charge of the project scope. So there could be certain changes that will be good in terms of having the entire scope keep on track, right? In terms of keeping the project on track, in terms of keeping the scope of the project on track. So there could be certain changes that you should be accepting, but then there could be certain changes that you must avoid in order to ensure that your project remains on track. So this is a balance, a critical balance that you as a project manager need to make to ensure that the project stays on track, right? So that is why it is important to understand control scope in the first place. Another thing is that control scope and validate scope are two different processes. That much you'll already know, right? But then a lot of people confuse the two, and a lot of people are confused in the understanding of both the process. And some of the folks, and I've spoken to a few, and they think that control and validate sound similar, have similar meaning, or at least similar connotations, and that is why that is the cause of the confusion. So it's important to read and understand control scope process so that you can clearly differentiate it from validate scope process. By the way, we've already covered validate scope. We've gone a lot deeper into validate scope. We've made several videos on it. I'll share the entire playlist in the description below if you want to understand what validate scope is. All right, back to control scope. Let's get ahead. Let's try to understand where does it fall in the PGKA mapping. So in the PGKA mapping, as you can see, validate scope process is just above control scope. A lot of text will say that validate scope. They'll cover validate scope after control scope. We have a slide for that as well, so we'll go over it later. But then control scope, as you can see, is highlighted by the red oval shape. This is where control scope falls. So this is the project scope management knowledge area. The knowledge area is project scope management, and the process group is monitoring and controlling process group, right? So this is the final process of the scope management knowledge area. We have covered every single process already. I'll share the link to the to the entire playlist of scope management knowledge area so that you can make use of that and go over all these processes. We've talked about plan scope management, collect requirements, define scope. We've gone very deep with WBS. We have taken a lot of your questions as well around WBS, and we have discussed WBS in great detail. We've talked about validate scope. Like I said, the link for the playlist of validate scope will be in the description. I'll also throw in a link to the WBS playlist in the description, right? So the final process that we are going to talk about as part of control scope, as part of scope management knowledge area, is control scope. So let's get ahead, let's understand, and let's start off with a lesson on control scope. All right, so control scope basically contains two things. The first is measuring and assessing the work performance data against the scope baseline. So, in order to understand this sentence itself, you need to know what work performance data is and what scope baseline is. So, scope baseline we have covered a bit in this video itself. Even work performance data as well, we have covered a bit in this video. Again, we have already created videos on work performance data. I'll share a link to that. We've also covered scope baseline in detail, so I'll share a link to that as well. A lot of videos will be available in the description as resources to understand the control scope process. Now, the second thing that you should be doing as part of control scope is managing any changes to the scope baseline. So if there's any changes to the scope baseline, you need to manage those changes as well, right? So first thing is you will measure the scope baseline, right, with the work performance data that is going to be generated, and you'll assess that work performance data. And the second thing that you're going to do as part of this process is if there are any changes to the scope baseline. Like I said, what is work performance data? What is scope baseline? I'll talk about it in briefly. I'll discuss that briefly in this video also, and I'll also share a link in the description below to the videos where we have talked about uh, work performance data as well as scope baseline in details. All right, so let's understand the steps of control scope. This is where you'll also understand work performance data. This is where you'll also understand what scope baseline is. And this is where you'll understand what exactly is done as part of the control scope process, right? So, like I said, we don't believe in memorizing the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. We believe in understanding the steps. We believe in understanding what exactly happens in processes rather than memorizing stuff, right? So these are the steps. There are 5 steps from which you will be able to understand what control scope process is all about. First thing, work performance data quantifies the completed project work. So this is what work performance data does. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll cover it a bit. So work performance data quantifies the completed project work. So whatever project work that has been completed, to come up with a number, how to quantify your completed project work. That is what work performance data does. So work performance data, will give you numbers, will give you a quantity of the completed project work, right? Which can then be compared against the scope baseline. What is the scope baseline? So again, briefly we have covered it here. Scope baseline is basically project scope statement, right? That's a document that states what is the project scope. Then work breakdown structure, which is WBS, and WBS dictionary, right? So these 3 documents make up the scope baseline. So what you're doing in first step is you have certain numbers as part of the work performance data. You are going to compare that data with the scope baseline, right? So this is going to give you a certain assessment, right? So you're making this assessment, how much work you have completed against what is the total scope of the project. That is what you're doing in the first step of control scope. Now, once this measurement is in place, right? Once you have this measurement, once you have this assessment, right? The magnitude of variance, if there is any variance, that can be determined, right? So let's say when you are doing this, for instance, let's say you realize that you have completed 20% of the project work. Then you look at your scope baseline and you realize, well, you should have actually completed 40% of the project work. So you're 20% behind. So there's a variance of 20% here. So that is step number 2. You determine what is the variance. Now, in step 3, the next step is to decide if a corrective action, preventive action, or defect repair is needed to bring the project back on track. So if you have any variance, right, you will see what kind of corrective action or preventive action or defect repair is needed, right? So you saw that there was a variance of 20%, right? You have completed 20% of the project. As per your scope baseline, you should have actually completed 40%. So what you're going to do now is that there is a variance of 20%. So you'll come up with certain corrective actions, or you'll come up with certain defects that you need to repair as soon as possible or on priority to make sure that you know, fill in the gap, you fill in the variance, you cover the variance. Let's go over to step 4, which is on next slide, step 4 and 5. Now, step four, before we read the step four, before we go over step four, let's read what's there in the brackets here, right? Corrective action, preventive action, and defect repair are major causes of a change. We have made a video on this as well, right? When we talked about change management. So I'll share the link to the entire change management playlist as well in the description below. And I'll try to find this video of corrective, preventive, and defect repair, um, which are basically major causes of the change. We discussed that. So now that you understand that corrective action, preventive action, and defect repair, they are the major causes of change. In step three in the previous slide, we talked about how to fix a variance. You might have to take one of these actions, right? You might have to perform one of these. Now, that means that this is going to introduce a change. What happens when a change comes? You already know it if you have been following us. Whenever a change request comes in, right, you have to perform the change management process. You have to have a change management plan for your project, and you need to perform the change management process. You need to take the changes to the change control board, CCB, and you need to get those changes approved. You need to have before even you take it to the CCB, you need to assess, right, what is the impact of this change on the project constraints, right? The scope, the schedule, the cost, the quality. You need to do that. So that is precisely what step four here is, right? If a change request is needed, I'm reading step four now. If a change request is needed to fix the variance and conform to the scope baseline, remember we talked about how you should be on 40% completion. Your project should be 40% complete, but you're only 20% right now. That means you will come up with a change. You will come up with a better plan to conform to the project scope, right? You will make sure that the project is back on track. So to introduce that change, right, on the impact of the change, when you introduce this change, the impact of the change on project constraint needs to be evaluated, and the change needs to be approved through the change management process, which we just talked about. So this is the whole step four, right? You get the change approved, you get the change assessed, and then after that you get the change approved from the change control board. And finally, the last step is that the project work is replanned and documents are rebaselined. Your entire project management plan needs to be rebaselined if you are introducing a change which is going to impact the cost, the schedule, the quality, and other project constraints, right? If it is going to be impacted, you will have to have a new project management plan. All these documents which were already baselined will have to be rebaselined. That needs to be done with every single project change. So these were the 5 steps how you control scope, right? You are doing your assessment, you're coming up with changes if there are any variances found in your assessment, and then you're performing the change control process, and you are doing the rebaselining of the of all the documents if a change is being performed. Back to our point three, where we talked about how the next step is to decide if a corrective action or preventive action or defect repair is needed to bring the project back on track. Now you might wonder, preventive action, what does that mean? How did that come around, right? So let's say you were supposed to complete the project. The project should be at 40%. You are only at 20%. What could be a preventive action here? And that is what we are covering in this slide. So there could be instances on the project, right, whereby following the project management plan could itself invite trouble, right? So what does we mean here? What we mean here is, let's say there is no variance in the measurement that you did, right? In the analysis that you did. So you found, based on your work performance data, that you are 40% complete. Based on your scope baseline, you realize you are pretty much on track. You are covering the 40% of the project scope is already covered, and your work performance data and your scope baseline, they seem to be in tandem. So there is no change as such required, right? But that is when you realize that the next work package that you're going to deliver, right, could be could take a lot more efforts than what you initially thought. And that this knowledge you might have gained by completing 40% of the project, right? There could be certain certain information that you received while you were completing the 40% project, whereby you realized that this next work package is going to take a lot more time. So then it is not a corrective action or a defect repair that you're going to do. That is where you will be taking a preventive action for that work package to make sure your project stays on track. We have an example below on this slide as well. So that is going to help you understand it in clearer fashion as well, right? So what it means is that project management plan itself is flawed. That is what I said, right? Uh, Now, let's say you estimated that a work package can be accomplished in 2 weeks, but later you realize that it will actually take 6 weeks of effort. That is what I was talking about, right? While you were completing 40% of the project, and while you did that on time, on target, you're completing the scope. 40% of the scope is actually complete. Your work performance data and your scope baseline are in tandem. The information that you received, the knowledge that you gained by completing 40% of the work, you realize that there was a certain work package which we estimated will take 2 weeks, but it will actually take 6 weeks, right? So this is where preventive action comes into the picture. This is where you need to take a preventive action, and you need to introduce a change request to change either that work package itself, either reduce the scope of that work package, or you're going to change the schedule of the project, and you're going to account for the 6 weeks that is going to be taken to deliver the work package that we just talked about. So this is the time you should be controlling scope, right? This is where the word control comes into the picture. This is where you need to control scope. You need to make sure that you're on track. Now, what if you come up with too many preventive actions, right? So let's say you completed 40% of the project and you realized these other work packages that you had earlier estimated were all wrong. We somehow managed to complete 40% of the project uh, in tandem with the scope baseline, in tandem, delivering all the work packages, but the remaining ones are tough nuts to crack, and you need a lot of preventive actions. And this is not something that just you think, but this could be a certain thought in the minds of the project team as well. And what could end up happening is that you would receive a lot of change requests from the team that believe that they are suggesting preventive actions. So what do you need to do here is, as a project manager, now you might get overwhelmed with the change requests that are wheeled as preventive actions, right? The coders, they might come to you and tell you, whoa, we felt, you thought you'll complete something in, we estimated that we'll complete something in 2 weeks, but it seems we are going to take 2 months. So let's do this as a preventive action. Let's remove this out of the scope of the project, right? You might get these kind of requests. These are change requests, right? So you might get these kind of change requests, or others for that matter, right, which could be wheeled as preventive actions. Now, this slide is real life project management. This slide is not bookish PMP exam project management. This is real life project management. On your real life projects, you are going to get requests like these. What would you do then is, this is where you need to keep tab on the scope baseline, right? Your scope baseline, which contains your scope statement, your work breakdown structure, the WBS dictionary. You need to refer to those documents. You need to refer to the requirements traceability metrics. We have covered this in the past. I'll share the link to the in the description about the RTM metrics. So you need to keep tab on these documents that you have prepared already for your project, right? And you need to make sure that if there are change requests which are wheeled as preventive actions, right, uh, they should be handled correctly. And your scope baseline and your RTM, they are going to be your best weapons against such unnecessary changes which might, pop up. This is how you would actually control the project scope. This is where you will actually control your project, your control your project team. You need to have certain influence as a project manager on the project scope, on the project team. You need to have certain influence. You need to, but then at the same time, you need not be so rigid, wherein you discard uh, preventive actions which were actual preventive actions and not wheeled as change requests, right? So that's why I said in the first slide itself that this entire process of control scope, you have to, as a project manager, maintain a critical balance between what change requests you should accept, change requests that are really preventive actions or corrective actions or defect repair and are going to help your project stay on track. And you need to have that critical balance between these useful change requests versus uh, change requests which are just wheeled as preventive actions, right? So again, this is the critical balance that control scope process teaches you. Control scope process teaches every project manager out there. This was a lot of details. I understand this video, but this is all that you should know about control scope process. We'll definitely have a few more videos on control scope. We'll talk about variance analysis, which is also a tool of control scope process, and it is important to understand that as well. But I hope you were able to understand how critical and how important control scope process really is. Finally, on some texts, you will see that validate scope is something which is covered, but then you'll see control scope being covered before validate scope, right? We have already covered validate scope, but in certain texts, you'll see that control scope will come after validate scope, but you should not imply that control scope is something which you do after validating scope, right? Validate scope will typically happen once your deliverable is ready, right? Once a deliverable is ready, you will go to the key stakeholders, the client, and seek their formal sign off. But control scope is something which can happen at any time. The steps that we just talked about, right? They can happen at any given time during your project, right? So that is the reason why control scope can take place anywhere. In certain text, if they say that validate scope is before control scope, right? They just talk about validate scope before control scope. That doesn't mean that you will control scope only after the validate scope process. Control scope can happen at any given time in the project. Validate scope is something which will happen once the deliverables are ready and once you request the client for a formal sign off, right? Validate scope, you do after your deliverables are ready. Control scope, it is an extremely proactive process, and you as a project manager need to be controlling scope at all times. So that's all that I had in this video. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Hit the bell icon so that you get notification whenever we upload the new video and the next video. And hit like button if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something about validate scope, which I'm sure you would. PMC Lounge is our handle on social media on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And do check out the website pmclounge.com, your number one free resource for PMP and other project management certifications, as well as project management industry information. Thank you.